Hey folks, today I'll be doing an in-depth review of Titan Souls. I'll be covering the game in its entirety, so there will be spoilers. Titan Souls was developed by Acid Nerve and released in 2015 for the PS4, PS Vita, and PC platforms, the PS4 being the platform this review is based on. Titan Souls is an action-oriented puzzle game that pits the protagonist against nearly 24 titans, where both sides can be killed in a single hit. Titan Souls' simple premise is complemented by a simple control scheme. The protagonist can run, roll, shoot arrows, and call arrows back, all of which is explained in a minimalistic introductory segment. The lack of complex controls allowed the development team to map multiple buttons to the same purpose, baking in a degree of flexibility if the player doesn't like what the game suggests. The suggested control scheme, however, contains a subtle but very important hint. The suggested fire arrow button is square, and the suggested roll button is circle. Most Western players hold their controllers such as pressing these simultaneously is difficult. Players can either do one or the other, and transitioning between the two isn't very fast. The takeaway is that players shouldn't need to do this. In other words, a twitchy run-and-gun playstyle isn't recommended by the developers. This subtle nudging extends into the 4 tutorial bosses, each of which teaches a critical lesson, if the player is willing to hear it. Sludge Heart teaches the player how to aim. iCube prods the player to exploit boss movement patterns. Brain Freeze introduces stage hazards and protected titans, and Goliath underlines how small a safe window to shoot can be. While I'm usually in favor of slimmed-down tutorials, I think Titan Souls takes it a bit too far. The subtlety in the opening segment allows the player to grossly misinterpret what Titan Souls is. Titan Souls is not an action game, given that it can be completed without running or rolling. At its core, it's really a puzzle game. Action just happens to be the language, the mechanism by which puzzles are solved. Players that don't grasp this concept get an entirely different and entirely more frustrating experience from the game. The sense of progress of learning and unlocking a Titan's secrets is missing, replaced by frantically beating your head against a wall until you get lucky. One reviewer commented that boss fights felt like a war with a random number generator. This is a crucial miss on the reviewer's part, but the development team should shoulder some of the blame. If the goal of game design is to convey a certain experience to a player, then I think it's a miss when the game hardly attempts to convey a big part of said experience. While I'm certainly not asking for something like this, I think striking a better balance would augment the title's accessibility without harming its underlying design. Once players move into the game proper, they can explore the map at their leisure. The fixed camera is angled from a top-down view, but the three-dimensional world is almost coerced into a two-dimensional viewpoint. The best way I can explain this is by showing an example. If you were looking at this map head-on and interpreting it as a three-dimensional space, you'd expect to see the sides of these railings, but you don't, so you naturally interpret it as a top-down, two-dimensional view. However, the angle on the staircase and your ability to see these upright walls indicates the view is not top-down, but actually partially head-on. These two perspectives are not simultaneously possible, generating a slightly uncomfortable feeling. But I think the right word is whimsical. The world of Titan Souls feels almost dreamlike, with its wisps of wind blowing through the air and calm serenading tones. I suspect the slightly unrealistic camera angles are an intentional part of the game's setting. They convey a subtle hint of confusion, which makes sense given the protagonist's search for truth. They also enable some pretty nifty level design, allowing the developers to include hidden shortcuts that are only hideable in a two-dimensional environment, but only possible in a three-dimensional environment. This staircase is the best example. It's impossible to get an angle on the entrance given the two-dimensional view, but the staircase would also be physically impossible in a two-dimensional environment. The level design here is very intentional, and I think the developers actively traded some cognitive confusion for nifty environmental tricks. Once I noticed this, I couldn't unsee it, so for me personally, it's more confusing than it is nifty. but at the same time, I think it's a core part of the game's charm, and I don't think it would be right to take it out. As players explore the map, they can tackle the Titans in any order. The one-hit nature of Titan Souls means that bosses sit on a knife's edge of balance. Too easy and they'll suddenly feel trivial. Too hard and they'll suddenly feel impossible. There's very little room for error. I imagine that the development team spent a significant amount of resources getting this right, and I think by and large they nailed it. Each Titan feels lovingly handcrafted. I didn't encounter a single one that felt like filler. They were all unique, first-class encounters. Each boss even receives its own soundtrack, and several had completely unique graphical effects, such as Mulcahy's Sparks and Vinethesis's Poison Cloud. These are bafflingly expensive decisions given the length of the average boss fight. The development team really cared about the quality of these fights, and that really shines through. The nature of Titan Souls, however, practically guarantees that some fights will fall flat. Take a look at my fight with the Yeti on my first playthrough. I almost feel like this is an intractable issue given the game's design. Things like this are just going to happen. I'm not really sure what the development team could have done differently. The purism of the mechanics lends itself to these situations. Speaking of purism, one Hidden Titan contains the game's only concrete exposition. I critiqued Titan Souls for its obtuse tutorial, but I think it would have been fascinating to extend the purist philosophy to the entire game. The one design philosophy that shines through in Titan Souls is focus. A single mechanic is thoroughly and exhaustively explored. I would have loved to see this applied to the plot. Titan Souls is incredibly close to having no direct narrative whatsoever. I obviously can't have it both ways, and I can't decide which one I'd prefer more. As a small aside though, I do think the exposition is ultimately unnecessary. The dark nature of the bow should be obvious, given that virtually all Titans are initially non-hostile. The last thing to discuss about boss fights is probably the game's biggest flaw, the runbacks. Players can spend upward of half their time fighting a boss just running back and reinitiating the encounter. One problem with this is the nature of the fights themselves. Titan Souls is a puzzle game, and figuring out the right approach to take down a Titan requires some trial and error. Segmenting these trials with runbacks is incredibly tedious. It's especially grating when the player can't see a death coming, such as the first time they encounter Onyxia's electricity attack. The more serious problem, however, is the tempo. Boss fights are stressful, adrenaline-induced affairs. Runbacks, in contrast, are relaxed and calm. Jumping between these two mindsets becomes incredibly uncomfortable. This is most obvious when the player takes on Truth. Truth has plenty of tricks the player will die trying to figure out, but there's no runback. As a result, the fight feels incredibly fair when compared to the other Titans. Players can try it over and over without mindlessly running back. Truth demonstrates that death is punishment enough. The runbacks themselves don't add value. Some might argue that Dark Souls effectively uses runbacks as a form of punishment, and therefore it follows that it makes sense here too. The development team mentioned Dark Souls as an inspiration, so I think this point is worth discussing. I have 3 issues with it. 1. Dark Souls is not hit or be hit. Players that get killed in boss fights do so because they made several, often egregious, mistakes in a row. The mistakes are more severe, and so is the punishment. 2. The amount of time fighting a boss far exceeds the amount of time running back. 3. The length of the runback correlates with the difficulty of the fight. Harder, more technically challenging bosses often have multiple shortcuts that are rewarding to use in and of themselves. In other words, the runback is not as dull. Successfully completing Titan Souls unlocks a number of new game modes, including Hard Mode, Truth Mode, Iron Mode, and No Roll, No Run mode. I tried out several of these and was surprised at how much replayability they add. Puzzle games are traditionally difficult to play multiple times. I think the inclusion of well-designed additional game modes helps justify the game's asking price. I think most people would find it hard to justify spending $15 on what is otherwise a 3-hour game. Titan Souls is one of the few games that really grew on me as I played it. Many of its subtle, artistic touches take time to properly appreciate. Its purest design philosophy results in a game that is quite unlike almost any other game on the market. It's definitely not perfect, but it's very much worth experiencing. Uncompromising vision usually is.